You asked, what happens to my brain as I get older and how do I keep it sharp? Today, I'm going to talk about how your brain changes. Some things get worse, some things get better, but we're also going to talk about how it is that you can keep your brain sharp as you age. When I first started doing brain research, one of the topical questions that kept coming up, that people kept asking me about, was how do I keep my brain sharp? And as I age, what's happening to my brain that is natural and normal? So how do I know the difference between what is pathological, when should I see a physician, versus how can I make sure that I'm keeping my brain really sharp and active, and how do I know if it's normal? So I did about 3 years worth of research. I was on multiple television shows, and then I traveled all over the world on stages telling organizations and people about what to expect from normal, healthy, aging brains, as well as how to keep them sharp as you get older. So today, let's start with what changes about your brain and what you can expect in terms of the natural and healthy aging brain process. One of the ways that I remember how it is that brains change over time is what I call Mr. H SKIMP. And I've made this little acronym up, but the idea is that Mr. H SKIMP comes to visit. Now, the H stands for hormones, the S stands for sensory, the K for knowledge, I for intelligence, M for memory, and P for physical ability. Let's talk about the H first. Mr. H SKIMP, the first H stands for hormones. As we age, our brain produces and circulates different neurochemicals and different hormones that are mediated through our brain. Those hormonal fluctuations, of course, create things like andropause and menopause, which has an effect on how the brain operates, but it also includes things like different circadian rhythms, different sleep cycles. So some people will sometimes ask me, why is it that I used to be able to sleep through the night, and now I find myself up at 3 a.m., but I cannot stay awake at 3 p.m.? The difference in hormonal fluctuations changes this. It changes your circadian rhythm, your hormonal fluctuations, which of course means it changes a lot about how your brain is processing your day and your time and your body. Your appetites, as an example, those start to change. So our hormones really do change over time as our brain ages. Mr. H SKIMP comes to visit as our brains get older, and the S stands for sensory receptors. Probably no surprise that the sensory receptors in your body, of which there are 5 senses, right, like sight, smell, touch, taste, these change over time. And what we see is that the sensory receptors change mostly toward dulling. And so what happens is that the sensation that we actually experience is less over time. And so you probably had this experience yourself where you don't hear as well, you don't taste as well. Now, the other thing that happens is that the actual sensory receptors dull over time, but they also are less accurate. So what ends up happening is that the actual signals that get sent to the brain are then transferred but are interpreted differently by the brain. And so what we see is not just sensory receptors dulling, but the brain's ability to interpret that sensation, it gets worse effectively over time. Next is when Mr. H SKIMP comes to visit, knowledge, the K. Knowledge changes over time as well. Now what's really amazing is that what we know is as a healthy aging brain changes, knowledge becomes different. And so how you both intake information and process information becomes different over time. Now, things like reasoning, we know financial reasoning, that starts to decline. Decision making actually slows, so your ability to make a decision slows as well. But also the things that you know are different. And so the way that you know information starts to change, and the way that your neural networks integrate information changes as well. Over time, what we also see is that the I, intelligence changes. And so what we start to notice is that things like fluid intelligence decreases, but things like tacit intelligence actually increase. And so as you age, the normal healthy aging brain process is to have intelligence actually be different. Things like decreased ability to reason with numbers or with math, decreased ability to reason with logic, And what we also find is that new information is harder to assimilate into existing intelligence networks. When Mr. H. SKIMP comes to visit, we also think about the M, memory. The M stands for memory, and the fact that memory does naturally change over time. And so what we see is that because all memory is a reconstruction, we actually see decreased accuracy in long-term memories. And so as an example, when you remember something, what you are doing is accessing a neural network that was practiced the last time you accessed that memory. Or said differently, what you're accessing is your neural network the last time you thought about that. It is not, in fact, an accurate depiction of those events. So over time, your long-term memory does become less accurate. And as you've probably experienced, so does your short-term memory. So it becomes harder to actually input new information into neural networks, as we've found out. And so our short-term memory also fails us. And this is why, as we age, we can remember something that happened to us when we were 22, but it's really hard to remember what we had for lunch yesterday, as an example. Finally, as Mr. H. SKIMP comes to visit, we talk about the P, or the physical changes that the brain undergoes. Now, your brain is very largely gray matter, which is the actual neurons, white matter, which are the fat that circulate those neurons, or the neuronal cells, or axons, and a whole bunch of space in between. And so what we see is that, in fact, both the white matter, which is that fat, those fat cells that help conductance, that actually decreases. Your gray matter decreases. The number of neurons you have actually decreases as well. However, that's okay, because when we look at dementia or some of the diseases of aging brains, it's really the white matter that is critical. So it's the white matter that we want to preserve, which of course we'll talk about later. The other thing we notice is that in the aging brain, there's also a little bit more in the way of inflammation. Now this is natural and normal, but it does decrease processing time and it decreases conductance, so that over time, it will take an older brain more time to make a decision or to reason something out. Okay, so we've talked about Mr. H. SKIMP coming to visit and all the things that change over time that maybe aren't awesome. Let's talk about what gets better with age, because like a fine wine, as brains age healthily and normally, a lot of things in fact do get better. One of the first things that gets better is interpersonal skills and what we call emotional intelligence. In fact, the aging or normally aging brain does get better at interpersonal skills, at emotional intelligence, at something we call theory of mind, or TOM, which is the ability to project what someone else might be thinking. They're also, aging brains, better at using their mirror neuron system, and it's exactly as it sounds. That system mirrors how other neurons are firing in other people. And so that mirror neuron system actually becomes much better at doing its work, at much more robust in terms of its neural networks. And so what we see is that over time, interpersonal skills, ability to put yourself in someone else's shoes, ability, frankly, to get along with other people, improves and increases over time. What this really means is that as your interpersonal and emotional skills get better, you also become more sympathetic, more empathetic, and much more easy to understand what someone else might be feeling or experiencing. And so the emotional centers also get much more acute and much better at processing. As you age, another thing that improves is what we consider to be cause and effect decision making, as an example. So this is really one's ability to predict, one's ability to anticipate what something is going to create or cause. So you know, as an example, different than a baby might, you know what happens if you throw a rock out of a window, or you will know what happens if you drive too fast. And so cause and consequence become much more real, and you have more neural networks for that, and you become much better at predicting what's likely to happen in certain scenarios. And so cause, effect, trajectory, and predictions actually become much better over time with the healthy aging brain. Now, one of the advantages of being really good at cause and consequence and long-term predictions is long-term, bigger order thinking. And so what we see is in the healthy aging brain, your ability to think big picture becomes better, your ability to think long-term becomes better, and this improves something we call intuitive thinking, which is the ability to actually put two and two together or see patterns in bigger order items, bigger order circumstances or contexts. And so as you age, the ability ability to actually look at the bigger picture and understand what might be happening or what might happen in the future improves over time. Also, as you age, your attention actually will get better, or at least your attention to detail becomes more improved, more concise, more accurate. So wherever you started in the spectrum of detail-oriented versus big picture-oriented, as we get older, we actually become both capable of looking at the long-term bigger picture as well as more detailed. So it's almost as if you're polarized in that ability, but you're much more able then to actually pay attention to some of the minutiae that maybe a younger brain would miss. The healthy aging brain also gets better, of course, at accruing its experience and understanding what knowledge is real wisdom. And so the older brain is actually much better at dealing with things like ambiguity, which can be very uncomfortable for a younger brain. And it's much better at things like tacit knowledge, at knowing what its expertise are. So the older brain knows what it's good at and knows what it's not good at. And so it also has a lot of knowledge that's encoded in neural networks that we consider to be tacit knowledge, which is knowledge that you know, but you don't know how to explain that you know it. It's things like being able to do up your shoelace. You definitely know how to do up your shoelaces, you just have a hard time sometimes describing that. One of my favorite things about the natural, healthy, aging brain is the fact that over time, you actually become, wherever you started in life, happier and more optimistic. There's a reason for that. What we say in neuroscience is that negative emotions and negative memories, they decay first. And so as you look to your past, you actually remember it through what we often say is rose-colored glasses. The past, as you remember it, is not necessarily the objective occurrences, but is the rose-colored version of that. This has advantages, though, as we get older, because what it means is that if we assume that the past occurrences are going to be like the future occurrences, then a very rose-colored past means a much more optimistic, brighter future. And so as we get older, wherever we started in the world, however we started in our personality set, we actually get more optimistic and happier. Things might be getting worse in our brain, maybe in our physical circumstance, but in actual fact, we get happier about it and more optimistic about the future. Okay. So you asked the question, how does my brain change? What can I expect? And how do I keep it sharp? Well, there are a few pieces of advice that the research would corroborate about what it is we can do to make sure that our brains stay sharp. The first one is to stay social. I know this seems fairly intuitive, but it's true that over time we often stick to our existing friend sets dwindle, and then we become less social as we retire, we don't go to work every day. So what's really important is to find a social network and to stay social, whatever that looks like. That might mean joining the church again, that might mean going back and being part of a group or of a hobby. It might mean that you become a Walmart greeter, but the idea is that if you are social, there are huge and vast neural networks in your brain that will read that sociability like reward. And so staying social is a really key component to keeping your brain sharp as you get older. Another key piece of advice for keeping your brain sharp as you age is to stay physically active. Now, that's a challenge for many as joints get older and as muscles and ligaments start to become a little bit harder to move. It doesn't need to be really rigorous. It just needs to be something every day. So if every day you can make sure that you move a little bit, what we say in neuroscience is that movement is like magic to the brain. And what it does is it actually activates knowledge, learning, and memory networks. So a little bit of movement actually increases your memory, both short-term and long-term. Another piece of advice for keeping your brain sharp as you get older is to not quit your job just yet. What we've shown and what the research shows is that people who retire too young actually age faster and they age cognitively much faster. And so what we see, and this is really great news, is that baby boomers, as an example, are starting to do work into their older years. They're not retiring as soon, partly because they are the healthiest, wealthiest, happiest generation to have ever lived. But what that actually allows is a decrease, a slowing of cognitive aging. So if you want to keep your brain sharp, consider doing your job, but maybe 2 days a week or 3 days a week. Maybe don't retire just yet. Another key piece of advice is to keep learning, whatever that means for you. Now, some people will ask me after I give a talk like this, they'll say, so I do, my crossword every day, I do Sudoku, is that enough? The answer is probably no, unfortunately. What happens is, over time, as you get really good at doing crosswords and Sudoku, you actually aren't learning anymore. And so what happens is that over time, that becomes something that is totally cemented into your neural networks. Instead, you should be doing something that frankly feels a little uncomfortable and is sort of hard. And so as a really good example, this might be when you start traveling more and learning new cities, when you start to learn a new language, go and pick up your real estate license. I've had those questions before, and they're all really great examples of ways to continue to learn. Just remember that learning, almost like going to the gym, if you don't feel the burn, then you're not actually learning. It's something you already know. Another thing that the research shows is that if you pick up a hobby, you will keep your brain a lot more active. And so keeping your brain sharp over time is to engage in hobbies you've always liked or to find new ones. Effectively, what you're doing is you're keeping your brain guessing, you're keeping your brain active, and this will help you have fun while you continue to learn. Another piece of advice from the research is the notion that as we get older, we should continue to give back. Definitely join a charity, whatever it is, but this will help with a general sense of feeling optimistic, of feeling positive about the world. And one of the ways that the research says you should do this is, as an example, to mentor youth. So if what you do is you find somebody who is in your same industry, maybe it's something you knew really well, you knew how to do really well, you were an expert in some field, this might be your opportunity to take that knowledge and hand it over to the younger generation. And so if you can stay active in your field of expertise and or with others, you are effectively giving back, which we know increases your overall general positive affect and therefore how sharp your brain stays. Another thing that the research shows is that you should continue to challenge yourself to try new things. And what this is really about is not letting yourself fall into a very consistent routine that doesn't have any spontaneity in it. And so what you should notice is if you're starting to get into a routine that is a little too staid, that's 20 years old, you might think about how you can switch that up, what you can challenge yourself to do, push yourself outside of your comfort zone, and be a little more spontaneous, because that spontaneity lays down new neural networks and really keeps your brain guessing. And what that does, just like learning, picking up a hobby, mentoring people, it helps with neuroplasticity. And what we are trying to do is increase how neuroplastic your brain is on an ongoing basis. So make sure that you're not in too staid of a routine. Definitely challenge yourself to be as spontaneous as possible. The research also shows that if we want to keep our brain sharp as we age, it's really important to stay spiritually active, whatever that means for you. And so this is when it's a really good time to go back to church or temple or synagogue or mosque and to stay as spiritually active as you can. If that's not religion at all, whatever it means for you, point is that your spiritual self is actually feeding your personality and your happiness. And so what all the research shows is that those who are more hopeful are actually more happy over time. If you want to keep your brain sharp, another key piece of advice is to make sure to eat properly and maintain your proper nutrition as you get older. Now, what we see is that a lot of people, as they retire, they end up in a different routine. Sometimes they're empty nesters, sometimes they live alone. If any of these things are true, we find often that nutrition can sometimes go downhill. You might start to skip meals, you might start to feel like it really, what you eat doesn't matter as much. The opposite is true. That couldn't be further from the truth. What we want you to do is to continue to make sure that you're getting all the proper nutrition in your day, that you're eating fairly consistently, and that you're getting enough food, because this, of course, is important for how your brain functions. Finally, what's really important as you age, if you want to keep your brain as sharp as possible, is to really try to enjoy life. Find ways to de-stress. Find ways to have humor in your life. There's a whole body of research that points out that the more humorous you can find things, the happier you are and the less stressed you are. And so the more that you can try to de-stress, the better off. What we notice as an example through the research is that anxiety in older people is often mislabeled. It's actually not taken as anxiety, it's taken as dementia or as some other unhealthy or pathological brain states. So really managing your stress proactively and trying to enjoy things, however that looks for you, is really important for having your brain properly function and making sure that you're staying as sharp as you can through your older years. As a final word, as you look toward keeping your brain as sharp as possible as you age, one of the key pieces to remember is that your brain does change over time, and that's okay. In fact, if you follow some of these pieces of research-based advice, what we know is you do not have to get sick. The brain does not have to end up in dementia or with Alzheimer's or otherwise pathologized over time. Your brain will change. It's a completely natural thing, but it does get worse somehow, and it does get better in many ways. And so keeping active and taking advice from all of these key pieces of research will really help in keeping your brain as sharp as possible over time. Thank you for watching. I hope you found this helpful. I'd love to know in the comments below what your favorite piece of advice or what your favorite insight was. Please do subscribe, and we'll be back with more videos just like this.